Aloha and welcome to this introduction to the UI frameworks module. In this module we're going to focus on Twitter Bootstrap 3.0, and our objectives are to learn the basic approach to developing web applications using the Twitter Bootstrap 3.0 framework. And I want to start with a little caveat. If you were to Google Twitter Bootstrap, you will find lots and lots and lots of what looks like extremely helpful references to Twitter Bootstrap. But unfortunately, in the last month, Twitter Bootstrap went from version 2.0 to 3.0. I'm sorry, there's an error there, and it's not 3.09, it's just 3.0. And this is a very big change in the way you use the framework or the syntax of the framework. And so most of those references are no longer correct. Okay, so what you'll do when learning Twitter Bootstrap framework is you're going to need to kind of carefully tiptoe your way around the web, relying mostly on the official published documentation for Twitter Bootstrap 3.0. I don't think this is going to be a problem. We're not going to do a lot of real fancy stuff with Twitter Bootstrap. The very basic understanding of it, I think, is going to be more than sufficient for the kinds of stuff that you'll need to do. And with a basic understanding, you'll be able to develop, really nice looking web apps. So don't worry about that. And a lot of great documentation will come out about Twitter Bootstrap 3.0 in the near future if you want to move on to more advanced things. So you might be asking yourself, if there's all this great documentation for Twitter Bootstrap 2.0, why the heck aren't we using it? And that's because Twitter Bootstrap 3.0 is super cool, and I want you guys to be using the latest and greatest. It's a mobile-first responsive framework, one of the very few out there, and that's the future. So your investment in this framework is going to be well worth it. Okay, so when I talk about a UI framework, I want to be specific that actually I'm talking about a web UI framework, and in particular what I'm talking about is a package that provides basically a set of CSS classes and or JavaScript functions to facilitate the development of the layout of your pages, maybe typography, and where things are, providing a more attractive look and feel for the amount of typing that you have to do. And in particular, one of the big things is providing some level of consistency across different browsers. So if you're using Firefox or Chrome or IE, whatever, you want your things to look the same. And that's something that plagues web designers, is the differences between the way the different browsers interpret HTML and CSS. So a good framework is going to try to insulate you from that. You don't have to worry about it so much. Now later in the semester we'll be starting to look at web development frameworks, things like the Play framework or Ruby on Rails or Django, and that, unlike a web UI framework, provides support for interaction. So you can actually submit a request to a site and return a page and then fill out a form or click a button and something else will happen. Right now we're really just focused on the layout and the look and feel. Okay? Now most web development frameworks will allow you to choose a particular UI framework to use. So what's going to happen when we're using the Play web development framework, we'll combine that with Twitter Bootstrap for our UI layer. So it's not like we're going to abandon Twitter Bootstrap later on in the semester. Okay, so there's a lot of UI frameworks out there, and a lot of them are really good. There's a framework to imitate the Metro UI on Windows. There's jQuery. Probably most of you have heard about that. That's a very popular, perhaps the most popular JavaScript UI framework. There's the Yahoo User Interface Library. That's a little more old school but extremely popular. There's a kind of a competitor to Bootstrap called Foundation, which a lot of people like a whole lot. All of these are good. Again, it's somewhat like IDEs, and whether NetBeans is better than Eclipse versus IDEA versus Visual Studio, whatever. They each have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay. In this class, we're going to choose Bootstrap for a variety of reasons, not because it's necessarily the best, but it has this nice combination of features that I think is going to serve you well. regardless of whether you use it forever or go on to use some other user framework. The first thing is, it's a pretty good UI framework. It's the most popular project on GitHub. It's very well designed, and it's open source, and so it's definitely quality. Secondly, kind of out of the box, it provides wrappers around many JavaScript components, so you can get pretty far along with Bootstrap in the design of a nice user interface without ever having to actually manipulate the DOM yourself, and writing actual JavaScript code. And the third thing that I think is super cool about it, and one of the reasons why I want to give you guys some exposure to this, is that it has a mobile-first design, which puts it in the vanguard of responsive mobile-first UI design framework. So in order to understand mobile-first, you have to kind of understand responsive. So let me spend a couple minutes talking about that. So what you have to, what we all know is that there's a lot of different operating systems, and there are laptop devices, tablet devices, and phone devices. And people use all of those types of devices to interact with the internet. Okay, so if you're developing some internet service, you have the problem that you'd like to be able to communicate with users regardless of whether they're using a laptop or a tablet or a phone. And if they're using a laptop, it's not such a big deal about what their operating system is, because in almost 99% of the time you're just going to use a browser. But when it gets to a tablet, there's two operating systems, iOS and Android. When it gets to a phone, there's actually 3 operating systems if you want to include the Windows phone, which I think you should, because it's kind of a cool phone. My daughter has one. Okay, and if you want your user interface to kind of work correctly, you have to take into account that the size of the screen varies dramatically, from 2,500 pixels wide if you're using a cinema display on a laptop, to only 480 pixels wide, and simply your user interface has to be completely different if your screen size is 20% of what it would be on some other environment. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, there's one approach is to simply code a separate application for each of the environments that you're finding yourself on. So you could, you've got this cool kind of service you want to provide. You do it in HTML for people on laptops. You do it in iOS for people on iPhones. You do it in Android for people on Android, and you do it in Windows for people on Windows. Okay, and you can come up with a super great user interface to your application, but you've just developed 4 different code bases that have to be designed, that have to be maintained, and debugged, and that's a lot of work. That's not to say if you're in a big company you might not do that. Like Facebook, they definitely have a native application for all of these different kinds of environments, because it's important to them. Okay, but most of the rest of us, aren't Facebook. We don't have huge development staffs and resources. So there's another approach that's now available with HTML5, and that is that we can just have one application that we code, and everybody's going to view it in the browser that runs in their environment. So if you're on a tablet, you're going to run your browser. If you're on a laptop, you're going to run a browser. If you're on your phone, you're going to run your browser. But what's cool is the HTML can check and see what screen size am I currently trying to be rendered on, and I'll lay myself out differently based upon that screen size. Okay, so the great thing about that is that now we're not coding 4 native applications and having to learn 4 completely different user interface frameworks or environments. We're just building one user interface, and it's going to be a little more complicated because now it's actually got to kind of figure out, do different things based upon the environment that it's in. But it's not the same as having to learn the difference between iOS and Android and be equally fluent in both of those environments. Okay, so here's, there's lots of responsive websites out there. Here's Disney.com. You can see on the right side, that's how it looks on a laptop. And then in a laptop, you can actually simply just resize the screen, make it very narrow, and you can see basically what it would look like on a phone. And so you can see that the, instead of this long nav bar with games, video, TV, movies, what's happening is this little thing called a pill on the left-hand side of the top of the screen with the 3 horizontal bars. You press that with your finger if you're on a phone, and the menu will come out, okay? And you can just see Disney across the top, and then you can see the photos are actually smaller, and instead of having basically 3 columns in the laptop, we've gone to 1 column on the phone, and so forth. And all of that can be done relatively simply in HTML, HTML5. Okay? So responsive is great. It gets rid of a lot of problems, but there are times when you want to have native applications. In one case, if you're Facebook and you simply want the optimal look and feel in each application, then you might go ahead and devote the resources. But another reason why you might want to go ahead and create a native iOS application or a native Android application is if there's some feature of the environment which you want to exploit, and it's native to that environment. So if you want to use Siri, if you got some cool app and it's going to exploit the presence of Siri in the Siri API in order to get its thing done, then of course you're going to write an iOS app to do that. Okay, so there's certainly cases when native applications still make a lot of sense, but for most cases, if you build something that only works with Siri, then of course your audience is only going to be iPhone users, and so that's kind of a limited slice of the pie. My view is that most of the use cases that you guys are going to come up in a development scenario, you're going to want to have things that run in all kinds of different environments, and so learning a little bit about responsive web design is a good way to kind of get going. Okay, so now we understand what responsive is. What does mobile first mean? Well, as I said before, there's a little bit of complications in the coding in order to make an HTML redisplay itself depending upon the screen size. And a lot of frameworks, kind of first generation UI frameworks, particularly ones that happened before HTML5 came out, they never thought about this issue, and so when HTML5 came out and there was the possibility of making things responsive, a lot of frameworks had like special files. Even Twitter Bootstrap 2.0, there's a special file that you'd load that would create some special commands that would kind of retrofit a mobile behavior on top of what was originally basically thought of as only working for laptop style environments. Okay, so that's kind of the mobile last design. You basically go out there and you design things for a laptop, and then you start to worry about mobile after you've finished with the laptop, and then you kind of kludge something together that would seem reasonable on a phone. With Twitter Bootstrap 3.0, one of the things that they did is they said, listen, in the future, basically all of us are going to be interacting with the internet mostly through phones and that particular form factor. So let's design Twitter Bootstrap 3.0 to really kind of acknowledge the fact that that's the predominant interface to the internet of the future, and our framework should really view that as a first-class citizen, and that in fact when you design something using Twitter Bootstrap 3.0, it should almost kind of seamlessly work out of the box in a reasonable way on a mobile display screen size. So that's what you're going to find when you're using Twitter Bootstrap 3.0, is that in fact things, as you go down to a mobile screen size, it's just going to do stuff to try to make itself fit. You're not going to have horizontal scroll bars appearing and all that kind of stuff, kind of by default. Okay. It also so basically it's going to engineer in this default behavior. That may not necessarily be the optimal behavior, and you can go from there to kind of customize the way it redisplays or reformats the layout for mobile to make it more appropriate to your application. But the essential part of it is that you can view the mobile environment as a first-class citizen in Twitter Bootstrap 3.0, and all of the designs are organized around the idea that mobile is a primary, interface. Okay, so that's my little brief introduction. Now you can move on to the tutorials while I start showing you how to install Twitter Bootstrap and do some basic layouts, and then we'll move on to the practice WADs.